Hi, Honors U.S. History classes. Today we're going to start Unit 2. This is a pretty big unit that's going to cover four major topics: the French and Indian War, the American Revolution, Articles of Confederation, and Constitution, basically the second half of the 1700s. Although a lot of your notes will be given via presentation this way, it's still really important that you guys take your own notes. You should be able to pause this if we're moving too fast and go back and listen to things. So keep that in mind. It's really important that you still have your own notes as we move through this PowerPoint. So let's talk a little bit about the French and Indian War, which today's presentation is going to focus on. It's a war that lasts from 1754 to 1763. On the slide, you'll see our two key standards that we need to cover. The first one is a look at understanding European settlement in North America with a focus on the French and their settlement primarily in Quebec. And we're going to look at some maps to show you just how far-reaching this settlement was. And then secondly, look at some of the causes of the American Revolution. So we first want to think about, where are the French? As you look at this PowerPoint, you'll realize that France actually had a really large empire throughout Canada, around the Great Lakes area, into the we call the Mississippi River region, and then also where my mouse is, we're going to refer to this as the Ohio River Valley. The French made their money off of fur trade with the American Indians. The French were Catholic, so they were interested in spreading their faith. And just like all of the European powers, they wanted an empire. They wanted the three G's: God, gold, and glory, and this was their ticket to do it. By the middle of the 1700s, this long-standing rivalry between England and France had really intensified. Each side wanted the other out of North America. They wanted to be fully in control of North America. In particular, the French had this region right here, the Ohio River Valley. It was rich, fertile farmland, and the English wanted it. You were actually starting to see some British colonists kind of cross into this no man's land, areas that they both had claimed. And as you can notice that there are differences in settlement patterns. The English are all up and down the coast, where the French are heavily concentrated around waterways, which is important for transportation purposes. So what this ends up leading to is a war between the French and the British over control of North America. The name is a little misleading because it makes it sound like the French fought the American Indians. But that's not true. In fact, most, not all, but most of the Native American tribes sided with the French. The French had a much better relationship with them. The English tended to take their land, conquer them, kill them, spread disease, and the French weren't that hostile with them because they relied heavily on them for the fur trade. This war also is going on in Europe and is known as the 7 Years' War. And in Europe, you'll see other European powers get involved as well. This map illustrates the war being fought both in the Americas but also in Europe. I wouldn't worry about this too much, but it just helps us to understand that this was a global conflict and not limited to the Americas, but it will have really significant implications for the colonists in America. Ultimately, what's going to happen is that the French will lose this war. There were many colonists that actually fought on the side of the British. They took great pride in this. The French will lose all of the land that they had claimed in North America, which is kind of this peachy pink color here in the center, and the British will gain it. The Spanish will gain the land west of the Mississippi River, and that will eventually flip hands as well back to France later. The Treaty of Paris officially ends the war in 1763. What's important is that the American Indians, they're going to lose their allies with the French being defeated. And that's a really big loss to them because in their mind, the British are the ones that have been taking their land and now they're under their control. And there's a lot of concerns about colonists crossing that mountain range into this Ohio River Valley. We keep mentioning the Ohio River Valley, so I thought a map would be helpful for you guys to visualize this area we're talking about. This is the area that was predominantly French controlled going into the war that the English so desperately desired, and it's going to continue to cause some conflict even as the war is ending and ultimately over. So when we think about the impact of the French and Indian War, there's a couple of really important things to remember. And honestly, this is the key part of what we need to know. When the war is over, England is in severe debt. And they had been taxing their citizens throughout the war to pay for the war. And as the war is winding down, they feel that it's really only fair to ask the colonists to pay their fair share of the war. The way the British look at it is that the war was fought in defense of the colonists, so it shouldn't be too hard to ask them to pay for the debt. A second thing that comes out of it is the colonists are pretty proud of what they have accomplished. They've served in the militias that fought the French. They feel like they are partially responsible for the victory. They see themselves as equals with the British soldiers. But throughout the war, they start to realize that the British don't see them that way. Even George Washington writes reflections on how the British officers spoke down to him, and they start to realize there's a little bit of a disconnect between them and the British. They had always seen themselves as fully British citizens, but they're trying to realize that the British don't see them that way, and more of us kind of a backwards people, which is really upsetting to them. And then last but not least, if we think about that map of the Ohio River Valley, we need to know that there are lots of different tribes that live there. And these tribes find themselves in a really interesting situation because they live in territory that's now under British control in an area that is very desirable to the colonists. So colonists start crossing the Appalachian Mountains and they move into this Ohio River Valley. And we're going to see fighting that breaks out. And this fighting is actually referred to as Pontiac's Rebellion. And the British have to go in and they have to put this rebellion down. And the king and parliament, they're looking at this and they're like, oh my gosh, do we have another war that's breaking out in colonial America? So the king decides that he's going to forbid all colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. And this is referred to as the Proclamation of 1763. And this is really going to outrage the colonists. They believe that they are entitled to that land. They fought in the war. They should be able to move there if they choose to do so. And they largely ignore this. And a lot of people believe that this is actually kind of where the seeds of the revolution are being planted in this proclamation and really their response to it. The colonists are still entirely loyal, but they're not happy with this decision, and it's kind of foreshadowing the trouble that is going to come. So to summarize, this is what North America looks like after the war. The deep red sections belonged to England prior to the French and Indian War, and they gained the pink area. So the size of their empire has increased dramatically, and when the war is over, the French will be very, very bitter, which will be really the perfect conditions for when we decide that we are going to fight for our independence. It's going to kind of encourage the French to cheer for us and ultimately aid us because they really want to see the British lose out as sort of like revenge for losing the French and Indian War and losing all this land to them. So be able to picture this as we move into the next couple of notes.